Hello, welcome to this programme on Science Matters. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, an organisation set up some time ago to try and get new audiences of people to discuss some of the big issues of the 21st century. And we're really pleased in this programme. We've had the help and the support of the British Council, who felt it was important to talk about issues around science and society. And in this particular programme, we're going to concentrate on the whole issue of food scarcity.
And I'm Andrea Gordon, and this is a programme where you can take part, sending in your comments and your questions whilst watching the programme through your computer. Also, if you want to tweet us, we are at #FoodScarcityGN21. That's #FoodScarcityGN21. If you'd like to find out more about our events and go to our website, we are on www.meetup.com/GlobalNet21. But for the duration of this programme, please send your comments and questions through the Internet TV platform or tweet us.
Food scarcity is obviously a big political issue. We know from today there was a report from the Church of England that looked at food scarcity and austerity. Some people think, though, that it's a global issue, and in the future, because of population pressures, food scarcity will become a very, very real issue. Others believe it's not an issue because if we have the right economic and political management, we can deal with this problem and we don't have to go into innovation, scientific or otherwise. Well, in this discussion, we're trying to involve you and others in that debate. It's important to involve civil society, decision makers and producers because we're all affected by this particular issue. And in this programme, we've got people involved in this who are a general viewing audience. We've got GlobalNet 21 members as well. And we've got two universities that are involved. University of Tampa in Florida have sent in some inserts and comments that you will see later, though it's a bit early in the morning for them to be watching it. And we've also got Christchurch University in Canterbury who've also sent in some inserts, and we believe and hope that they're actually watching this programme live now. So if you are, welcome to this. Now the British Council, like us, also believes that engagement of civil society in this is important. And when we talked to Tim Slingsby, their engagement officer, he had this to say about it. Let's hear what Tim had to say.
Okay, so I think that through the GlobalNet 21 network and through the British Council network, we can immediately reach out to those people who aren't identifying themselves with science, who don't already have that declared interest in science. So through this online presence, we reach out to our networks and don't necessarily immediately hit those who go to science centres, who visit science museums, and would consider themselves as reasonably science and research knowledgeable. And furthermore, I think that by bringing together different groups, those that don't have a declared interest in science, but by bringing those people together with scientists and researchers and civil society, what we're also able to demonstrate is that science is for everybody, and science is all around us, and science has an effect on local communities and on a global scale. And it can perhaps be considered one of humanity's universal languages, in the same way that music or maths or football even can be considered a universal language. And therefore science helps to foster more international collaboration, and through those sorts of collaborations, not necessarily simply between scientists, but between science and civil society and members of the public, we build trust. And through that building of trust, we allow progress and positive change in the world. And the topic of food scarcity is clearly one that is pressing on an awful lot of people at the moment all around the world. And therefore I can't think of a more topical topic through which to sort of open up this discussion and lead to more collaboration and endeavour.
So in this programme we're going to look at food scarcity and the role that science plays in that, which is a very central role. But it's not really as easy as that, because science is not a unified discipline. There are a lot of different types of sciences, and that can lead to a lot of different and sometimes conflicting advice. We spoke to Dr. Sarah Lieberman of Christchurch University, who explains this to us. Listen to her here.
As you say, they've got to take a lot of different things into consideration. And science is one of those things, but a lot of people see science as being objective. Science isn't as easy as that. There's always different views of science, and policymakers have got to take that into account, and that isn't always easy to do. You have to look at which scientists are making the statements that policymakers are listening to. You have to look at where those scientists are funded. You have to look at what their agenda might be. So policymakers have a lot of different things to take into consideration. Where the scientists come from, they could be university scientists, they could be government scientists, they could be company scientists, and obviously each of them are going to have a different agenda. The other thing is that policymakers are elected democratically to represent all views on all subjects, so they're not experts on science, and science is so broad. You could be looking at all different aspects, even just within food scarcity. You could be looking at science of agri-biotechnology, you could be looking at science of bridge construction. There's lots of different forms of science, and policymakers have got to engage with that, but they can't be experts in all aspects of that. They never can.
Of course, it's not only politicians that can get confused, but also the producers of food can too. We spoke to Dr. Helen Ferrier, the National Union of Farmers Chief Scientific Advisor, and this is what she had to say. Agricultural science and technology are crucial to the future of farming in this country. While many farmers are already adopting groundbreaking technologies to boost production, we want to see strategies in place that can provide skills and training for farmers. And we also need to showcase how agriculture is an innovative, rewarding and business-focused sector, and promote it as a career choice for the next generation of farmers, advisors, engineers, vets and scientists.
But of course, what does this mean? That's something we hope to discuss in this programme. And we hope to discuss it with the two people you saw at the beginning of this programme who are going to help us with this. Professor John McFadden, who's from the University of Surrey and is a molecular geneticists, and also Barnaby Peacock, who is involved in international development at Practical Action, which is an organisation involved in intermediate technology. Okay, technological breakthroughs, which the NFU spokesperson mentioned, means different things to different people. For example, if you're in a highly developed economy, you might look upon that as being intensive agriculture, you might look upon that as being GM foods. But if you're in a developing economy, you may be looking at systems that are more sustainable, that actually help communities rather than replace them. And what does this mean? Well, we spoke to Grace Mukaza, who is the Regional Director in Kenya of Practical Action, and she told us what this means to her. Listen to what Grace has to say.
We need to look at technology and innovation. We need to look at people's traditional knowledge and systems. We need to look at the issues of vulnerability they are trying to work with, and in particular women, who are the biggest producers. We need to look at issues. How are they accessing land and using it? How are they accessing credit? Are the markets working for them? Are they able to have information and extension services? And are they accessing, the inputs, labor, fertilizers, seeds that enable them to produce enough food, bearing in mind it's not only subsistence, it's not only food for home, but they depend on that also for their livelihoods. That's what we are looking for.
And high and intermediate technology and science is often advocated by the different scientists, of course, and so making it very difficult to know what to do for the best. Margaret Gardner, also of Practical Action, believes there is strong scientific evidence for a low technology approach, a more ecological one. Let's listen to what she had to say.
I need to start with the fact that the majority of farmers in the world are smallholder farmers. So if you go back to about 2008, there was a worldwide, what was called the International Assessment of Agriculture Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, which was led by a guy called Bob Watson, who was the former chief scientist at DEFRA. The group of scientists found that tackling food scarcity, there's a huge role that smallholder farmers play in helping end hunger. And that comes through good soil management, through the conservation and management of water, through pest control, through the conservation of biodiversity, which has a massive role to play in our future, both in terms of farming, but also the future of our planet, and in the conservation of natural resources. And we believe that agroecological approaches can deliver on poverty reduction, which is primarily what practical action is about.
Well, Margaret clearly believes that intermediate technology and ecological viewpoint is important in development, particularly in developing countries. But there are others who take a very different point of view on this. When we talked to Sarah Lieberman, who you already heard from Christchurch, she had reservations about high tech being used all the time, but she did think in the future it could have a very real role to play in trying to deal with what might be a future problem of food scarcity. Let's listen to what Sarah had to say.
They might do in the future, yes. At the moment, I don't believe they do, to be honest, because I think the high-tech solutions that have been developed so far have been developed for very specific areas. So the GM crops that are currently on the market are actually really only any use in the USA. And yes, they can increase yields, but only in the US. So the corn that has pesticides built into it isn't really any use in areas of Africa where they don't have the same pests as they do in the USA. So selling that to other countries isn't really much use. So yes, you can increase production in the USA with these crops that have been produced specifically for the USA, but that's not going to work in developing countries where there's a need for more food. I mean, there's already food surpluses in the US. That's not necessary. What you might be able to do, and projects that have been started but have never actually come to completion, are genetically modified sweet potato and cassava. And if you could modify them to grow in harsher climates and in areas or in times of drought or saline poisoned areas, then that would be helpful. And they've been started, but they've never been successful. So a cassava or a sweet potato that can be grown in an area where they eat cassava and sweet potato, but it will grow in harsher situations, that would be useful. But for the moment, that doesn't exist. And people talk about these products as if they do exist and we're just not using them. That's not the case.
So there is debate within science, and of course a lot of other factors come into play too. Science is not the only factor, and some believe that it alone is not going to solve the problem of food scarcity. Roger Martin of Population Matters believes that if we are to tackle the problem of food scarcity, we should first address population. He told us, "The Earth is finite and degrading fast, and the population has tripled in my lifetime, now growing at 10,000 per hour. This multiplies all environmental, resource and economic problems, including food, water and energy security. It's no use reducing our footprint if you keep increasing the number of feet. And the more we are, the less there is for each of us."
And as you could hear, that was Andrea reading over that, not Roger in a high-pitched voice. But Roger did actually point out to us as well, when he gave us that quote of his own, that there are different sciences as well. And he referred to Professor Ning Zheng from the University of Maryland, who actually is in the area of oceanography and climatology. And he believes that the Green Revolution, for example, which has increased yields significantly, and some scientists might say that therefore important, though I know that's controversial, nevertheless he argues that it can have an unintended consequence, which in his science is a consequence, and that it can affect the carbon footprint on the planet. For example, he says, if you read this now at the bottom of the page, it says, "What we're seeing is the effect of the Green Revolution on the Earth's metabolism. Changes in the way we manage the land can literally alter the breathing space of the biosphere." So it's clear then that success in one area of a science may have consequences for another area of science, and this must make it incredibly difficult for decision makers when they have to choose between one and the other. And how they take their advice must be very problematic for them. Of course, there are others who believe that science isn't just the main question, that there are economic, political, and distribution questions that we have to deal with, as well as social and cultural ones. And indeed, when we talked to Sarah Lieberman, she thought that allocation was one of the major problems in tackling food scarcity, which is not a scientific issue at all. Let's hear what Sarah had to say about that.
A lot of food is produced already in the world. There's food surpluses in the Western world, and there's food scarcity in much of the developing world, and different areas of the developing world at different times. Food scarcity is very rarely caused by a lack of food. It can be caused by growing the wrong foods, it can be caused by political unrest, by wars, by natural disasters. But these are things that need immediate input, and a high-tech solution isn't necessarily going to change that. Distribution is normally the biggest problem regarding food scarcity. It's not a lack of food, it's getting the food to the people who need it. It's avoiding having European food mountains and huge warehouses full of grain in the US where it's not needed, but farmers are subsidised, and getting that food to where it's needed, but also where it's relevant. There's no point sending huge amounts of soya to people who don't eat it. There's no need to send huge amounts of food that isn't needed in a certain area to there. You have to decide where it's going sensibly, and distribution is a really important aspect of that.
So, if distribution were tackled, then food scarcity would not be such an issue, it is argued. Sarah's colleague John Fitzgibbon, also from Christ Church University, says there are other issues that come into play, like management, control and development. Let's listen to what he has to say.
We live in a globalized world, and we automatically take for granted that we can go to our grocery store and pick up goods from all over the world. But that relies on an extremely long and complicated process of coming from food producer in the developing world, anywhere else in the world, and getting it directly to our doors. And we're very fortunate in the West because we have a stable political and economic system that companies and food producers and retailers can invest in that system, and they can invest money in production of food and in the transportation of that food, bringing it to market and knowing that customers will have the ability to buy those products and have the money to do so. We take, for example, India. India is a vast country, huge amount of natural resources, but it doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to get those products even to market. So about in the region of 30 to 40% of all Indian food, food produced in India, rots in the trucks on its way to market. You know, we have a stable economic and political system that allows that to be achieved. One only has to look at Zimbabwe. You know, along the breadbasket of southern Africa, vast farms producing all manner of goods, both food products and both cash crops to be able to sell over the world for money to allow the citizens of Zimbabwe to be able to buy food. Political climate changes, the highly productive farmers are driven off the land. It's been redistributed for political reasons, not for social justice reasons, and the entire economy collapses and the starvation returns to Zimbabwe. Again, we look at the example of North Korea, where food is controlled, is used as a political weapon. So those that are close to the regime get access to food, those that are not close to the regime do not get access to food. So politics is extremely important in the system.
So, science has an important role to play in this debate, but there are different scientific paradigms. For politics, economics, social factors also have an important part to play. Okay, so this is a part of the programme where we involve our two guests and where we also involve students from Christ Church and from the University of Tampa. They actually sent in their comments, and I think you'll find those interesting, and we'll get our two guests to respond to them. The first set of questions came from students in Christ Church University in Canterbury. We asked them what caused food scarcity. Listen to what they had to say.
Food scarcity is caused by natural disaster.
Food scarcity is caused by a lack of infrastructure.
Food scarcity is caused by war.
Food scarcity is caused by corruption.
Food scarcity is caused by poor decision making.
John, Joe, it was really interesting, and get your title right this time. It's molecular genetics, isn't it?
That's right.
It's really interesting listening to them because none of those comments were about the science. It was all about other issues. Does that surprise you?
Sadly, it doesn't surprise me too much. I don't think as many people are aware of the contribution that science has already made to food production and the potential contribution of science to food production. I don't think it's something that's well known, but it is real.
And how did you react to those questions as well, Barnaby?
I would definitely agree with the statements coming from the students at Christchurch. They're very much the kinds of issues that different people face in different contexts. That wouldn't rule out the role of science. I mean, science has played a huge role in producing more food per unit of land, and it will continue probably to contribute to our ability in future to produce more. But the nature of that science might itself begin to change from one that is micro and molecular potentially to one that is more systemic. Looking at systems approaches is where I would come from a view of agroecology and production.
We'll come to that, the systemic approach later on, because I think that's a really, really important point. But, I mean, what do you think, John Joe, we have to do to get students, when you ask them that question again, to answer in scientific terms, to understand that there is a science behind all of this?
Well, I think one of the areas would be to get over the very important message that actually if it wasn't for science, millions of people would have starved over the past few decades. Exactly the same predictions that we hear today, that population is increasing enormously, we're not producing enough food. All of those predictions were made in the 1970s, 60s and 70s. And what happened wasn't political change. No political change actually changed the situation. Millions of people were starving, but what changed was the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, as one of the commentators pointed out, tripled the amount of food that could be produced on the same amount of land. That meant that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people did not starve because the price of food went down. And that's really, if you want to make people eat more, make food cheaper. And to make food cheaper, you have to make more of it. And that's simple. If you make more food, that's the easiest way to get the price of food down.
But Barnaby, you may not agree that the Green Revolution did have that effect. It had consequences as well that were not in the planned outcome.
Indeed it has. Places like the Punjab, where you see declining quality of water, you see acidification of that water, you see the drop in the water table. That isn't to say that the Green Revolution hasn't contributed, though. I'm myself an agricultural scientist originally. I'm now a practitioner, but the introduction of dwarfing genes to increase the proportion of a crop that is actually eaten, the harvest index, was one of the great breakthroughs of the Green Revolution, as was the introduction of a break to photoperiodicity, which meant that you could have more than one crop in any year grown in one field. However, I think we need to add to these contributions, and new types of contributions are going to be involving multiple interactions between lots of different types of crops and within the plot, but also different types of institutions and the way that farmers work with the supporting institutions around them.
Great, lovely. Please keep sending your comments and questions. We've got quite a lot on the screen there. I'm sure John, Joe and Barnaby will be pleased to answer them. So when we spoke to the University of Tampa students in Florida, what they said was interesting because they looked at it in two different ways. They said, yes, high-tech might be a solution, but working towards more sustainable methods would be preferable. Let's have a listen to what they said.
Hi, my name is Samantha Paff, and I'm a graduating senior studying International Cultural Studies at the University of Tampa. There's a global debate on the potential of genetically modified foods in alleviating the global food crisis, as these GM productions are claimed to increase the crop yields and thresholds. However, the long-term impacts of GMs are also threatened by the climate shifts that influence the capacity of irrigation in arable lands. Also, we have smart agricultural practices that are aimed to increase productivity of crop yields while reducing the impact on the environment and greenhouse gas emissions that are also brought on by this growing global agricultural business. How can we integrate both smart agricultural practices and GM technology to maximize both efforts in a manner that creates a truly sustainable solution to both current and future food crises? And moreover, should there be additional assistance and funding for farmers in developing regions in order to provide the training in these smart agricultural practices? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a student at the University of Tampa. I'm a communication major and I'm from Ghana.
Hi, I'm Malika Mutabuti. I'm also a student at the University of Tampa. I'm a finance major and I was born in South Africa, but I'm from Lesotho.
In Ghana, like, food scarcity is a huge issue. I know the government is trying to introduce GMO products, but I'm really against it because no one knows the long-term effects of GMO on like human life and stuff. So I think, but then again, people are starving, so it's like it's a really difficult issue to just like come up with a huge solution to it. So I feel like scientists should research into sustainable ways and natural ways of getting more food to people instead of GMO.
Yeah, I agree with Catherine on that because I think practically GMO food is actually much cheaper and it would work as, you know, food that would be able to supply a lot of people considering the world population increase. But I also honestly think that, like, ideally, if people could, like, scientists could do more research into more natural and sustainable food sources, that would definitely work.
My name is Grace Little, and I'm a government world affairs major at the University of Tampa. Global food scarcity has become an increasingly prevalent and debated topic in the international community. As of 2012, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has estimated that nearly 870 million people are suffering from chronic undernourishment. As most severe hunger is happening in the developing world, it brings to question what the true issues behind food scarcity are. Furthermore, should we be focused on sustainable farming practices, or should GM foods play a larger role in providing nourishment for the growing global community? Thank you.
That was sort of interesting, John Joe, because those answers did deal much more with the science. But does it sort of surprise you that although they were saying GM foods may have a future, they really wanted sustainable solutions to the problem of food scarcity?
Well, I don't see why GM isn't sustainable. It's as sustainable as any other form of agriculture. Modern agriculture depends on inputs. Although it's great to think of organic agriculture making a contribution, and surely it does and it will do in the future, but it produces a tiny fraction of the amount of food in the world. Most food is produced by massively industrial agriculture, and GM is just a part of that, really. And it's as sustainable as other forms of agriculture. It can be more sustainable. For instance, instead of applying herbicides or pesticides to your plants, you can grow plants which make their own herbicides or pesticides, and thereby reduce the amount of herbicides and pesticides that you can grow, that you need to apply to the land. So that can be more sustainable than conventional agriculture.
I mean, John Joe mentioned that big businesses are involved in this because of the huge interventions needed. But some people on our forums have argued really high-tech anyhow solutions are really catering to large industries. It's not needed. It's just actually supping up to them, as they put it.
I would certainly come from the position that there is money to be made from a food system, and the opportunity for agribusiness is to make money. Whether that is the most sustainable approach to developing the agricultural system, I wouldn't agree with. I think that there are plenty of things that need to be done locally. So, you know, there is actually so much more to be done locally that builds out from local farmer knowledge, that adds to it and contributes to the local capabilities, of the ecological capabilities within a farm, and building out from there, from existing farmers who, smallholder farmers, make up 95+% of all farmers, about 500 million farms across the world, 95% of them are small. And more than half of the food that's eaten in the world is produced by these smallholder farmers on 20% of the land.
I think you were sort of trying to get back on that one.
I was, actually. There's a lot of ideology which moves in this debate. And a lot of the ideology goes on along the line of GM is Monsanto, it's huge multinational corporation. That definitely makes it evil. Well, is aspirin evil? Is paracetamol evil? Are antibiotics evil? They are made by huge multinational corporations. Is that computer evil? It's made by a huge multinational corporation. You drive home in a car that's made by a huge multinational corporation. Conventional agriculture is mostly driven and by huge multinational corporations. GM doesn't change that. Monsanto sell mostly non-GM crops. So it isn't really part of the issue at all, but it's turned into it by this peculiar focus on multinational corporations being involved in GM. Of course they are. They're the only people who can produce GM crops.
That point, I understand that point, but let's look at another point I think you raised about a systematic approach. I mean, some people argue that when you are involved in scientific innovation, you're intervening in the environment, and that with high tech it's huge intervention. And one student from Canterbury Christchurch put this to us very forcibly, and I'd like to see you respond to that. Let's listen to what he says.
We should always bear in mind, when we're dealing with new technology in new areas, we should always bear in mind the law of unintended consequences. Everything is so interconnected with everything else, like societies, economies, and if we build a third world economy reliant on first world technology, and then the backing for it disappears, we've made the problem infinitely worse.
I mean, this is a sort of systematic approach idea that scientists and James Lovelock's view are very professionally reductionist. They don't see beyond their specialism, and therefore they don't see the unintended consequences of what they do. And what some people argue is a holistic or systematic approach. That's what you were saying, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, I was certainly taking that perspective, working from the farm field outwards. Everything is a system. You can't exclude yourself from the interactions with climate and rainfall and seasonal forecasting, with sunshine, with nutrient cycling. The whole agriculture is an ecology, whether you like it or not. Using and maximizing our ability to use that ecology is where we can get the real productive potential. I think that is high science, personally. It is not necessarily trying to replace that with alternatives that we've kind of made up and manufactured elsewhere.
And John Joe, how do you respond to that? Do you think very often with high tech they do not think of the systemic approach or the systemic outcomes or results of what they do?
Well, funny enough, I have an expertise in systems as well. I work as a systems biologist, although on tuberculosis, so I'm very used to thinking about systems, and I'm very aware of the unpredictability of systems. So scientists are very aware of it these days. And of course, unintended consequences can occur from the most benign changes. But that shouldn't make you afraid of change. The unintended consequence of not doing anything may be much more severe. People starving in the world today, about 1 billion people are undernourished. The simplest approach to making that number come down is to make food cheaper. So start simple. Don't worry too much. We can overthink a problem. Just make more food. That will make a difference.
Okay, well, thanks for that. But now this is the point where we come to the questions that are coming in live at the moment. Well, Andrea's looking through them and coming up with the first question, because there's quite a few already. Let me put a question that someone put on our forum, one of our members. He was saying all this idea of food scarcity is a charade. It doesn't exist. There's so much food rotting in the world, there's so much food waste in the world, and even with increasing population, we can feed the world. We do not need large interventions of science. All we need to do is get the economic management right. How do you respond to that, Barnaby?
I would certainly agree that we have to get the fundamentals right with the existing food that we have now. If we can't manage the food we have now properly, then how can we expect to manage the food that we are purporting to be able to produce in the future, to feed the future world? I don't like peddling certainties. We're in a world of, we know that climate change is happening. There is uncertainty in here. So what can we do? We can basically improve the efficiency of our use of existing resources in ways that we know how to do now. So I certainly start from that premise. Whether that answers all the questions we need to ask, I'm not so sure.
But John Joe, do you also share that view, or do you think that there will be a food scarcity problem in the future and that science must play a role?
Well, all the figures suggest that there will be a food scarcity problem. Population is increasing, food production is not increasing at the same rate, so the prediction would be, very simply, yes, there would be. And of course, no one can argue if we had less waste, there would be more food. No one could argue that political changes should be implemented to give a fairer distribution of resources, including food, in the developed world. People have been arguing that for decades, for centuries really. And that was argued in the 70s when billions more people were starving in the world. And the politicians and the economists argued one way, the scientists made new crops and made new food. And that made the difference, not the politics. So yes, certainly improve the losses from waste. Try to change the politics of systems. But the easiest way to make people have a healthy diet is to grow more food and make it cheaper.
Okay, right, now Andrew's been sifting through the questions,
Yeah.
so what have we got here?
I guess in a way leading on from that, we've got Joe Taylor in Manchester who says, what role can producing our own food locally play, like community farms?
Oh, well, that's one for you, Barnaby.
Massively important. Minimising, well, if you want to improve the efficiency of the way you use the resources around you, you've got to minimise the reliance on external inputs. You've got to maximise the recycling, the reuse of the materials that you already have there, of waste, seeing waste as an opportunity. Why is it that food goes into the city or into the toilets and out to the sea? All that nutrients should be coming back onto the land. So there are huge opportunities at the local level and even the national level and even the global level to maximise the recycling and reuse. I get a box, an organic box personally, that's my decision. There are community-supported agricultural areas where I live around Leamington. There's some great examples which produce nutritious, good, healthy food, highly productive places involving lots and lots of people. Personally, yes, I would definitely take that as a view of change for the future.
Okay, I think you're making us feel hungry. What's the next one coming up?
Mark Roest, and forgive me if I've said the wrong pronunciation of that, but he's in San Mateo in the United States. Hello. He says, the information I read is that the yields, especially in drought, of organic permaculture and bio-intensive gardening are 20% or more, greater than GMO yields. The elephant in the room is genetic adaptation of the target pests to the poison.
Well, that's for you, John Joe. I mean, organic is actually more productive than GM.
Well, it isn't. If you think that, go into the supermarket and look at the price of organic vegetables compared to non-organic. It's 20-30% more expensive. Now, why is that? Is that because organic farmers are making 20-30% more from you, or is it because their costs are 20 or 30% more? It isn't more. Organic is not more productive. So, and I want to correct something actually we've had in the program, but it's relevant to this. This view that GM is only for the developed world, the USA. No, it isn't. Half the crops, GM crops in the world, are grown in the developed world. 90% of the farmers who use GM crops are poor farmers. And they are making the decisions for themselves. They're not being forced into these decisions. That the most productive way, the most sustainable way, the safest way they can grow the crops for their children is to use GM. And that is their decision. It's not forced on them by any multinational corporation.
I think Sarah Lieberman did mention sweet potatoes and cassava as being an example of the point you've made. But I think you're dying to get in on that particular one. How you probably don't agree.
that you need to have soil organic matter, you need to retain that water in the soil to actually get the yields. 25% of the world's soils are degraded. You cannot replace degraded soils with genetic engineering. You cannot replace and regenerate depleted soils through fertilizers. You must have soil organic matter. That means you've got to have some kind of green manure going in there, cover crops, agroforestry systems, all adapted to the local context, the exact soils that you actually have, using the crops and knowledge that you have locally.
I guess you'd probably take issue with that, but let's try and get another question because I want to involve
Yes.
as many as possible.
So Maria Nash, London, she says, how will science deal with an epidemic, as is going on with Ebola, which is preventing people there with food going from one area to another? Could an epidemic have an international impact?
Well, that's a question one of the students raised, that disease and war, but disease they raised is a major issue in terms of food scarcity. If you have a major epidemic, it reduces production considerably. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, we know the response to Ebola is involving a huge humanitarian effort, but what's going to make a difference is science. Whether we get vaccines, whether we get drugs, and those are being produced by molecular science, the most reductionist science, and by the big pharmaceutical companies. So that's what's going to make a difference. So local solutions, we talk about local solutions for a lot of different things. Sometimes local solutions make a difference. Sometimes global solutions require global responses, the kind of resources that are only available to big multinational companies. And I think starvation is one of those. We still have 1 billion people starving in the world or malnourished in the world, and I think we've got to think of radical alternatives to really do something about that. All the politics that have taken place in the last few decades haven't made a difference. Green movement hasn't made a difference. In fact, I think it's made a negative difference, and I think science is what will make a difference.
Okay, I hope that you think that answers your question partly, Maria, but let's try another question. Sorry, I know you want to come in, but I want to get as many questions in as we can.
Okay, Ian Nolan in Birmingham says, would cutting down taxes on farming tools and pesticides help? Also reducing import duty on such items worldwide? Will all this help overcome food shortage?
But Barnaby, that's a question of management as well, not science. How do we actually create a political and management system that will make food scarcity manageable?
Yes. Well, I very much come from the perspective of the small-scale farmer in the South, in the global South, in Africa, South Asia, China, wherever they might be, and what they actually, how they benefit from the systems around them. So those systems are the financial systems, whether they can have access to credit, whether they can sell their crops into a market and not see those crops being I have a story. One story in Sudan. If you are somebody in Kassala state in Sudan and you move your livestock across the border to the next state in the eastern hills, you will be taxed both on leaving the Kassala state and on entering the Eastern Hills state to move your cattle to market. So tax regimes do play a role on do have an impact immediately on everybody, every producer everywhere. And it is important to actually look at these as part of the package of what we need to do to try and enable farmers to actually get into the market properly.
Let's pick up on another question.
Okay, this is from Back Up 4, and the city is the UK. So how do decision makers decide on policy when scientific advice often comes to alternative solutions, such as the difference between you two today? So I think you should both answer that.
Okay, John, I mean, we're going to deal with this in the last point of the programme, but if you want to briefly say, you know, poor decision makers, they've got all this conflicting information. What do they do?
Well, I think you've got to go back to the science, and a lot of the decision making, for instance, about GM crops is based on a poor understanding of the science. There's no evidence, for example, that GM crops will do you any harm if you eat them, none at all, and or no credible evidence. And all of the big scientific institutes, the Royal Society, the World Health Organization, the European Commission, have spent a lot of money looking into the science, and they can't find any problem with eating GM crops, but yet we're not allowed to eat them in the UK and in Europe. And that is because of bad decision making, bad policy.
And if you were going to give advice, that's not the advice you give, is it?
No, I'd start with the producers. If you want food produced more, you've got to start with the producers. And who's producing the food that the world's going to be eating? They are the small producers in southern countries, in developing countries. 84% of this 9 billion people around in 2050 are going to be living in the global south, in currently developing countries, middle and low income countries. They are currently being fed to the main by small producers in their countries locally, through local food systems. If we want to respond to the future of food scarcity, as we expect there will be, you have to reflect in your policies and practices the current position of where production is actually happening and build out from there. We have a yield gap in smallholder farming, a gap between what is actually being produced and what could be produced, as we know through kind of research and other methods, that there is a huge yield gap which is affecting these smallholder farmers in Africa and Asia. It is not so much affecting the big industrial players in the north. And closing that yield gap, increasing the production in the south of these smallholder farmers is where policy needs to focus.
So both your answers begs the question, how does the decision maker choose? Maybe we'll come back to that at the very end. Okay?
Okay, so Jack Brooks in Canterbury says, surely the greatest barrier to developing nations creating greater yields of food is Western companies patenting advanced technologies and making them too expensive for poor farmers to afford.
Well, this is about the relationship between huge technology and companies wanting control. And
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a view on that.
Well, most seed is bought from companies all around the world. Whether it's GM or not, you buy it from companies. The companies patent those seeds because, like drugs, they're very expensive to produce. They couldn't produce new seed unless they were able to patent, just as you couldn't produce a book or a record unless you were able to protect it in some way. So scientists and the companies who invest in new technology have to protect it. But there are some GM crops which are not protected at all. There is golden rice, this rice that could provide huge benefits to the world, and it's the only crop that is not grown commercially because of the huge lobby by environmentalists, and this comes back to the policy question, to prevent its commercialization, to prevent it being planted. And for that crop, golden rice, there are no patent issues because all of the companies have given all of their patents freely to anyone who wants to produce golden rice. They can make the seeds, they can recrop it, they can sell them, do whatever they like. And still, the green movement has consistently opposed and prevented the introduction of this potentially life-saving crop.
So, Barnaby, it's not the fault of these well-intentioned big companies, it's the nasty environmentalists.
Intellectual property is a problem. Most of the advances in agricultural science have actually come from farmers' fields. So salt resistance, dwarfing genes, photoperiodicity, the breaking down of this. These are all these were all introduced, have all been introduced by using conventional plant breeding methods. Now, these are conventional plant breeding methods using resources from farmers' fields. Farmers cannot become part of the intellectual property regimes from which are benefiting the agri-industrial corporations. It costs too much, and people actually don't have the awareness of what's the value of the crops that are in their field at this moment in time. Things like golden rice are kind of a little bit of a very large dead-end cul-de-sac, really. I mean, my point that I would have made, but I'm going to make it now, about epidemics is that if you want to risk an epidemic, the easiest way to do that is to put in single varieties. So epidemics in crop disease is by not having diversity. So you introduce golden rice and a single variety of golden rice. I'm not saying that food nutrition is not important, but I am saying that this is a bit of a silver bullet thing. It's just rattling around answer. It's just rattling around. It's landing the silver bullets on the ground. It's a bit of a spent force. We need to move on to something that's actually going to be useful.
30-second response to that.
500,000 children go blind because of vitamin A deficiency. About 1 million die of vitamin A deficiency. Golden rice has been shown to be able to provide all the vitamin A they need. This is not a spent force. This is not being able to become a spent force because the environmentalist lobby has consistently prevented its growth as a commercial crop all around the world. And I think it's a catastrophe, and I think the environmental lobby have blood on their hands, as other people have said, because of this.
Well, that's a strong statement, but instead of going into that, we'll let someone else ask another question.
Okay, this is from Mark Goodman, London. Could we make governments more responsible for their populations by creating some kind of league tables to highlight the impacts of food scarcity and food overproduction?
Roger Martin raised the population question, and we haven't really dealt with it, so maybe we should here. Do you think we can go on growing population, and can science tackle that, whatever the population rise is?
What experience has shown is the only real way to control populations is to make people wealthier, to allow people to eat more food. When that happens, they control their own populations. Any other intervention doesn't really work in the long term. So if you want to control populations, make more food.
And how do you feel about the population question? The population bomb, as it was once called.
It's good to have an agreement somewhere. You've got to, I mean, wealthier people do not have so many children. In Bangladesh, in our program work in practical action along the rivers, the chars, which are areas where people actually live on the riverbanks, these people are spending about 80% of all of their income on food. Now, if you want to deal with population issues, you've got to increase their wealth. That's not necessarily increasing the amount of food they eat. You've got to increase their wealth. There is food available, but people need to be helped out of poverty. So economic development that benefits the poor is something that we all must struggle towards, yes.
Okay, I think we've got time for about one more point.
This is from Sarah Lieberman, Canterbury.
My
is
gosh,
Sarah Lieberman?
she wants to appear on the programme 4 times.
But she says it's interesting because she says, what effect do you think the new EU law allowing member states to ban GM crops will have?
I'm sure you'll welcome it, John.
Well, I kind of do it in a way, in that it will allow some EU countries who want to make their own decisions to go one way or another. And if those EU countries that do not ban GM crops find that they're producing a lot more food, then it will make the decision easier for everyone else, because they'll see more food. I'll tell one little story. In Brazil, GM crops were banned. I visited the south of Brazil, and farmers in the south of Brazil were going down to Argentina to raid the markets in Argentina, bring the seeds back, GM seeds back, and grow the seeds in Brazil. And then when that was shown to be so apparent, Brazil gave up its GM ban, and now it's one of the biggest growers of GM crops. So if you allow producers to make the decisions, and this is going back to who makes the decisions, allow the producers to make the decisions. Why do you ban GM crops when there's no good reason for it? Allow the producers to buy them. Other people may not want them, other people may not want to buy them, but allow them to make their own decisions.
And do you have a view upon the EU regulations?
Yes, and on this example as well. On the EU regulations, let's see where it plays out. I'm kind of equivocal. I think that we ought to be more circumspect than we are currently politically. We're talking about food scarcity and future food scarcity here. That GM example of GM soya is for basically pig production in Europe and in the north, the global north. This is not the way to deal with the future of world food requirements. Yes, there's a market currently, but if we start trying to think ahead, I rather suspect that the market will move in a different way. It'll be much more localized. People's engagement in Brazil and other countries will mean that we're going to be moving to a more agroecological, more sustainable kind of agriculture and away from GM.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to conclude the discussion there because we're coming very close to the end of the programme, but I'd like to thank you both for taking part, John, Joe, Barnaby. You both won't agree with each other, but you created a lot of debate which will lead a lot of follow-up both in the universities themselves and in our members, and we'll be following this up with some activities. So thank you for that. Andrea.
So we've covered quite a large area in this programme, and we found that, yes, it's very complex. So how do decision makers and producers make their final decisions? Well, what advice would we give them as well? Well, we went over to Amelia Hadfield in Christchurch University and asked her that very question.
I think politicians face an uphill battle coming to any decision in many ways, and the scientific issues and scientific questions out there bring with them a degree of anxiety that I think makes it difficult for politicians to know where to begin. The sheer volume of information on so many different scientifically related questions that bear on public policy and foreign policy, I think are incredibly difficult and incredibly confusing. Foreign policy and public policy together are deemed to try to solve public problems like food security, like food scarcity. So politicians, I think, are probably best advised at this point to look at what exists in terms of information, first of all at the national level, and second at the international level as well. They're going to try to blend together what has been discovered, what has been understood, and then find within that areas that have not been researched, not been developed, and which are clearly going to impact on the decision that they're taking at that given time, be it food security or food scarcity. So it's going to be a delicate balance of information and research, public and private sector together, which has already been determined, which has already been ascertained, and then within that try to find areas that have to be filled in and use their best judgment, not just on behalf of the party line perhaps that they're towing at any given time, but very much for the sustainability of the population.
Well, we'd like to thank you all of you for taking part in this programme. We've come to the end of it now, both John, Joe and Barnaby, and also for the people who've sent in their questions and have watched this programme, and the students as well from Christchurch, Canterbury, and from the USA, from the University of Tampa. It's a good way of having civil society engagement, of linking experts with debate, and linking universities with the community as well. We hope this won't be the end of this debate or the end of discussion. In fact, it won't be, because this Wednesday, 2 days' time, we're running a webinar with Christchurch University where they're going to develop or present a lecture, and we're going to get from that lecture some feedback to this programme and the issues that have arisen. And we also hope to provide some feedback from this programme in a programme we're doing in January, which will be a general GlobalNet programme, but we want to actually follow this up as well. So we'll be doing a lot more activities on this. So thank you again, all of you, for joining, and thank you, both of you, for participating.
And remember, you can still tweet us at Food Scarcity GN21. And if you do want to go and visit our website and get involved in those programs that Francis mentioned, it's www.meetup.com/GlobalNet21. Thank you very much for listening and participating, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.